Welcome to Module 4. Welcome. And welcome to the Archives of Appalachia. Thanks to Laura Smith and all the other folks up here. We're visiting here virtually. We can see we've got some artifacts back there, and I've got a few things to show from the collections here, so get excited. I am. I'm also really excited to come to this week because the Patterson book, I feel, is a really important study in the field of Appalachian studies and of music studies in the region, because it goes really in-depth into some practices that have been really misunderstood. So she gives us a lot to think about. First, I'd like to go over a short introduction to sacred music history in the English-speaking Protestant North American world through printed texts. Just a quick thing, I'm not going to hit everything, but I'll start with psalmody, one of the things that a lot of Christian Protestant folks were using when they came over to the North American colonies. The Bay Psalm book is really important. It's the first printed book in this British sphere in North America, printed in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1640. It was a collection not of any printed music, but of psalm texts, just the words. And they were usually set to a meter and then sung. So the words were there for you to prompt, and it was assumed that someone could lead or the congregation would know the tunes. It depends on this technology of interchangeable parts that I have an interesting example to illustrate. This is the Scottish Psalter, published in 1929. And it's got psalm texts, as it says, the Psalms of David in meter. So you've got the psalm text here and the notation above. But as you can tell, you can pick different tunes and do different psalms. So if you wanted, for example, Psalm 23, you could turn to your Psalm 23 text down here, and if someone said, oh, I think Psalm 23 really does well with tune 47, if it's a common meter song, if it works, then you can just interchange your text and tune. So this is a neat demonstration of that practice in a physical form. And I didn't cut the book. It was already like that when I bought it. So to make this work, you needed these meters to have these standards. So you had common meter and the short meter and long meter. And a lot of the ones in that book are CM, or common meter. I guess that's pretty common. So Patterson gives us some thoughts on that. How did that work in practice? So amongst the primitive Baptists that she was studying, leaders often connected a tune with a hymn text repeatedly, maybe just because they liked it or thought it expressed something important spiritually. But almost half of the tunes that Patterson heard sung in her research were sung with more than one text. So there was a lot of flexibility. And she found that song leaders would adjust, but that whole congregations would follow the leader's variations. So they had an important role. This story I really love of Elder Evans. He hears a tune while working out in the field, and then he goes home and looks through hundreds of hymn texts that he had in books that he had at home before finding one that fit the tune he had in his head. So there's just this really interesting flexibility of tune and text that we just don't have anymore, especially if you're part of a church singing tradition. Usually things are kept, tune and text are kept connected. But that's not how it was back then. In the absence of notation serves, Patterson says, to the kind of heartfelt interpretation that they believe were characteristics of the generation before them. So this flexibility of interpretation they find is something that connects them with the early church, which is their goal, right? The primitive, getting back to the primitive roots of the church. So a lot of other people didn't think that that was really the best thing. They didn't like this practice in which there was more flexibility and more maybe things that didn't sound really perfect. So in the 1800s especially, there were movements, especially among urban mainline denominations, to regularize the singing, to uplift and to educate. And one of the ways that they did that was through songbooks and singing schools. And these were often took the form of these long books where the spine is on the short axis. And at the beginning of a lot of these, and this is the Southern Harmony, which was published in 1835. At the beginning, there will be an introduction that provides the rudiments of music, or how to play, a lot of explanatory text. And this whole technology of shaped notes that was supposed to help direct people to the right place in the scale. The triangles, the squares, the other shapes. There were a lot of other publications, first three-part collections like this, like the Southern Harmony. You can see a lot of those. Those are three-part arrangements of the pieces, and then eventually 4 parts. And there were 5-shape and 7-shape systems. We're not going to go into all that. But at first, these were technologies and practices that were meant to regularize the singing instead of this more flexible relationship of a congregation with a tune and a text. Now, of course, in the rural places like Western North Carolina and other places in the South and elsewhere, and other marginal areas and other backwaters, these long form, there were traditions of singing the psalms continued, and also the practices of leading the songs through chanting a little bit of the song, and so that everyone would know what to do, prompting in that way, continued. But in most urban areas, people moved to having a big organ and a choir, and during this period of time, as the 1800s continued, you moved from the long book form to something like this that has the spine on the long part of the book there. And most hymnals today are in that configuration, portrait instead of landscape. So in this period of time, we have a shift from the use of the psalms to the use of hymns. So hymnody, as we call it, was metered texts newly created, like Amazing Grace or Sweet Hour of Prayer. And again, we have there was a lot of flexibility between a hymn text and a hymn tune, just like there was with psalms. But eventually that got a lot more fixed. And these days, mostly the one hymn is used with the one text is used with one tune. Now, during this period of time, we have the Great Awakenings that were happening. We have camp meetings and other places where important musical work was going on. And these camp meeting songs emerged not in established churches, but in outdoor mixed-race spaces. Camp meeting songs were often repetitive, sometimes with choruses, an element derived from U.S. pop music performance. Minstrel songs is one place we can see the development of choruses in songs. There would be verses, and then everyone would join in, especially in a harmony, with a 3 or 4 part harmony on a chorus. We see that a lot in imprinted minstrel music from the 1800s, and that practice seems to have happened a lot in camp meetings as well. And spirituals emerged as well. That's a term for song practices and repertories that emerged mostly among African Americans. That the crossings of the race line there in camp meetings is a really interesting part of that history. And gospel songs emerged both in black and white forms. So that's a complicated thing, how that happened. Mostly after the Civil War, and Patterson tells us they can be distinguished from other forms of hymnody by the format of testimony, exhortation, or narrative, rather than that of praise, prayer, and thanksgiving. Also, there's this interesting category of Jubilee, like the Jubilee, Fisk Jubilee singers. That some people talk about a category of Jubilee songs, which are like Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, biblical stories, things about Daniel praying, and so on. These are more telling stories. And gospel songs are really characterized by this emphasis on the personal connection to the divine. Elsewhere, Patterson says that it's really important that these songs express personal spiritual experience and have this first-person viewpoint in the lyrics. And gospel songs became the bread and butter of Pentecostal and holiness congregations, African American and Anglo American, as well as Baptists and other folks. And these movements, the Pentecostal and holiness movements, started around 1900 and just exploded all over the country. Here locally, close, not too far from Johnson City, on the eastern end of Tennessee, there's some interesting history as well. James Vaughan started the Vaughan Company in Lawrenceburg around 1900. He was printing songbooks, and he soon founded a quartet, it might have been in 1910, to advertise his songbooks. And I think one documentary, there was this BBC presenter who says in the voiceover that soon the quartets became even more popular than the songs they were meant to advertise. So this is a really well-used Vaughan songbook. You can see it's got the spine, what's left of it, on the long axis. And the notes are in shape notes. So even though it's not a long, like a shaped note tune collection, the shaped notes are still used. And there's no part in the beginning that talks about how you should sing. This was just used, as it was. And on the back, it says 1,500,000 of the Vaughan songbooks published up to January 1st, 1920. He sold millions of these things. It was a huge business. And in 1922, he started the first commercially licensed radio station in the state of Tennessee to get even more advertising out about his product and about the songs. All right, well, back to primitive Baptists. I wanted to start with a question. Why did Patterson choose this topic and her approach to this discussion? One thought I've had is that the people she works with are thoughtful about their musical and spiritual practice. On page 58, she says that primitive Baptists are conscious of even subtle changes, and they are really critical of repertory, text, and melodies, and so on. And they seem to talk about it, and they're ready to speak about it to her. Furthermore, she says primitive Baptist women are, quote, conscious of being seen in a limited way, close quote, by people on the outside. And I think this is, it seemed like an important part of her research, to talk with women and to try and tell their story as they see it, instead of as stereotypes might convey it. Like Titan, she was working, Patterson says she's aware of these stereotypes of, quote, Southern mountain folk as ignorant, impoverished, and isolated. And she, like Titan, asserts that these stereotypes did not address reality or present reality. And she listens to what she calls, quote, accounts primitive Baptists give of their own experience. So just like with personal experience being really important with gospel songs, it's key in her work and in the practice of being a primitive Baptist. Men and women who are part of these primitive Baptist groups wrestle with doctrine and compare what they think to what a preacher or a song tells them. And they compare that with what they feel and what they feel they're led to believe and to value by the Holy Spirit. Her discussion of gender I find really fascinating. She looks at the gendered language in primitive Baptist song texts. It's interesting how they minimalize the mother role. Even though outside of church music, a lot of those folks probably listen to country music, which is suffused with mother imagery. And also it's interesting, she notes that there's a lot of implied feminine gendering of nouns in the King James Version of the Bible that a lot of these folks use. The soul is often referred to as a she or her, and the church or Zion is widely labeled as feminine. Her conclusion about women in primitive Baptist groups is interesting. She says their silence, quote, is part of a system that works for them and for the church. So this is it's sort of pragmatic in a way. I found that was a really interesting finding on her part. I really like how she wrote on page 84 about the women singing. So check that out. Make sure you get that part. Now, I just had to check as I was prepping for this and think, when did the Episcopal Church, which is my home community, when did they first ordain priests? The first ones were kind of a rogue thing in 1974, and in New Zealand, the first regular ordination of women happened in 1977. Not too long ago. It's just before I was born. What about women in scholarship? I looked up in the Society for Ethnomusicology, female leadership. Barbara Crater was an ethnomusicologist who focused on Slavonic folk music in Czechoslovakia, interestingly enough, in Greece, Rhodes, Romania, and Yugoslavia. She wrote her dissertation on Serbian wedding songs, and from 1971 to 73 served as the president of the Society for Ethnomusicology. So just some thoughts comparatively about how gender was playing out in different areas of life. Anyhow, I wanted to talk a little bit also about methods. How did Patterson do all this research into the history of hymn tunes and identify the tunes that were used to matched with the texts as she was recording them and analyzing them? One important tool she cites in her bibliography is this big old honking book right here, the Deal Hymns and Tunes Index. So you can see there are just lists of the hymns, and there are these codes in here by which the actual index, there's a way that she has of expressing the notes sort of in it with a movable do, whereas you have do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and it's the right here we have a tune that goes do, re, mi, fa, mi, and you kind of count that. You work with that as if you were alphabetizing it. So you start with do, and then do, re, and do, re, re, and then do, re, mi, if that makes any sense. So it actually becomes a way of indexing musical tunes. It's a really interesting tool. It's here in the archives of Appalachia as well. It's really some heavy-duty, old-school research using printed things. Now, this also leads me to a question, right? Because there's a little bit of apples and oranges happening in the research design of her work. Patterson was comparing printed versions of her tunes to her transcriptions of recorded performances, often finding that primitive Baptist folks were modifying the printed versions that she found using that Deal index. Now, I'd argue that any performance of a tune or song is going to be different from any other one. You know, like the Greek philosopher said, you never step in the same river twice. Same thing with performance. I think a better thing that she could have done, perhaps, would be to compare her transcriptions with other performances, transcriptions of other congregations singing their songs. But I can understand why she did the comparisons that she did. And it was enough work as it was, a lot of heavy lifting for her research-wise, even doing what she did. But it's something to keep in mind as you think about how you're structuring your research. I'm interested, on page 103, she talks about how primitive Baptists show an affinity for older hymns and psalm tunes from the earliest generations of hymnody and psalm singing in Anglophone America. They're called lonesome and old. You know, those are the things they used to describe it. And I find, you know, we were talking last week about how the folks Titan is working with sought out things that seemed older and sounded older. This importance of oldness within church practice. And here, again, we see in the gospel, like that Vaughan gospel songbook, even though it's my suspicion that a lot of people really didn't use the technology of the shaped notes. They seem old and they seem distinctive. And that's why they were kept on as the printing mode for music for many years, way after the time in which singing schools were using them to teach and regularize singing in the 1800s. It's just this kind of patina that continues on. And Patterson says, she talks about shaped notes as, quote, a symbol of American vernacular music that has always stood apart from the standards of European mainstream or American genteel culture. And this, I think this ties into what she finds as the primitive Baptist desire to create a distinctive singing sound. And she talks in the section on gospel songs and notations that when primitive Baptists sing gospel songs, they find different meanings than their counterparts in other religious groups do. For just as I am, that famous Protestant hymn, they think total depravity, while others would focus more on the repentance and salvation that's a part of that song. That's an interesting point of differentiation. Now, I've asked you in your response for this week to do some surveying of primitive Baptist musical activity as it's recorded and distributed on YouTube today. So A, identify 3 elements in some YouTube videos that you've dug up. I think I've asked you to find at least 3 videos. And find elements that Patterson describes, actions, sounds, places, texts, theology, interactions, and so on. And then compose at least 3 questions about that you have in your mind after doing all this, about the sound, practices, and ideas of primitive Baptist singing. And is there anything about what we've been working on this week that could inform your Soundpost project? So come up with 3 questions using things from the reading this week for contextual framing ideas, literature, and situations. And then assess the posts that other folks put up in terms of bias. What are we concerned with? What are things that we're leaving out of our discussions, searches, and thinking? And if you have any space left in your head, I'd like you all to hypothesize, how will primitive Baptist singing practices continue to thrive or not as time proceeds on and we're getting farther and farther from the ethnographic present of Patterson's research. I look forward to your reports and hearing and listening to what you found out.